Yeah, but if you take that example of the US, for instance, okay, they're talking about fiscal discipline, well, they still have the confidence of the market, and what Europe should do to be able to achieve the same? Is this Eurobond things, federalism? You think there's a way there, or if we don't do that, should we go to kind of a deeper crisis on the long run? Because as you just said, it will take some time.
I mean, there's no question that Europe, if they want to keep the Europe, they will have to be closer integration on a number of fronts. We don't necessarily have to go to a sort of federal setup like in the US, but certainly the fiscal compact, as everybody knows, is being drawn up and implemented now. There needs to be more checks and balances across the union on fiscal position, so we don't have a repeat on that. Issues are pan-European, so you also need to have effectively a banking union. So you need to have more integration of financial supervision and regulation and ability to do cross-supervision of banks, etc. So those factors are sort of necessary conditions, in a sense, to have a successful currency union. So what you can say, what they ultimately did is they started the currency union too soon relative to where they were in terms of the institutional setup. And it was, and we've seen the consequences of that now. There was not sufficient checks and balances on it. So you need to have these things in place before you can talk about a sustained, shall we say, situation there. Part of the fiscal compact, of course, is over the medium term to contain the fiscal situation, to bring that under control. Further efforts, I think, in terms of the banking union, increased integration on that front is also, of course, to get existing problems under control in the banking system, but of course also avoid further situation from materializing. So there's no doubt about further integration on the political front and other fronts are absolutely a must for this to be sustained.
Okay, maybe a question on the floor. So maybe we could kind of shift a little bit to kind of Asia or other emerging countries or BRICS, whatever you call them, or large emerging countries. So we seems to have a kind of consensus that so far the European crisis should remain mild, at the very least, not catastrophic. So would Asia be able to say, so they would not be shielded, if I understand, but are they able to kind of anticipate and say, build something together to make their own way with China as a leader, with other countries? So what's the future there, are solutions for Asia? Dan, maybe a comment also taking the example of China. Are they going to help Europe or just play for themselves and develop the real Chinese or Asian domestic market, if I could call it this way? Is this a solution?
I think that when one talks about the Asian response, and one talks about in Europe and the United States, people are only too willing to respond and give their opinions without taking into account the fact of different levels of economic development, the huge diversity of the region, and the fact that you really have sort of three power centers with different quality of power. You have South Asia, and India, you have Southeast Asia or the ASEAN countries, and you have China or the East Asia. Each one with different kind of an agenda. I think that the good story is that so far the crisis in Europe has been relatively contained. But then again, I feel that we've seen only the prelude. The actual show is only about to begin, and that will take a lot longer. So the question is how to deal with that. When one looks at the Chinese response, as I mentioned, I really believe that if one thinks that this is a crisis whose momentum perhaps is now turning and we're getting into something more sustainable, then perhaps the measures by the Chinese government have not been adequate. It could move faster, it could show more ammunition. But if the government believes that this is a long-term issue, this will take years. Whatever the Europeans say, if they have a fiscal, monetary, banking, liquidity, solvency, competitiveness crisis, it will take quite a few years before they really start containing it. And as Americans are faced with deleveraging, that will take years, as was mentioned. I think that overall, when I listen to the previous speakers, while we have very different approaches, very different conclusions, we tend to agree that so far Asia has been relatively contained from these issues. And as luck would have it, there's a lot of potential that has to do with the secular potential of these countries to last in this situation. However, as all pointed out, there are export channels or trade channels, there are financial channels that may become more tumultuous and so on and so forth. So I think that we've seen the good face of the crisis until now, but it won't be as easy in the coming years.
Leif, maybe a comment on that also, because we all kind of, if you go back to the previous crisis, everybody was pretty aware of the trade channel and trade crisis, but I think this time we may have this financial channel as well, because basically the banks are in difficulty in Europe, or potentially could be. So would that have a larger impact there?
Yeah. No, but I mean, the growth model of Asia has to change. I think that's a key lesson from the crisis. And if you look at it from a broader perspective, longer-term perspective, growth in the US and Europe is now going to be structurally lower than it was prior to the global financial crisis, because the pace of growth they had then was, of course, not sustainable. The way Asia has dealt with the, should we say, evaporation of, should we say, the permanent loss of output and final demand in these countries is, of course, through stimulus. Macroeconomic stimulus, both fiscal and monetary policy was eased in support to that. You had quasi-fiscal stimulus in China and what have you. But that's clearly not sustainable. That's not what's going to drive growth in Asia going ahead. So that's why China needs to rebalance to become more reliant on domestic sources of growth, more reliant on consumption as a source of growth. Other Asian countries have to tap into their own potential, invest more in basic infrastructures, grow their domestic sources of growth as well, and that requires a lot of structural reform. And of course, there can also be more diversification of trading partners. And we've always seen that Asia trades more with Asia, not just for the purpose of sending it through China and on, but also for the purposes of meeting demands of final consumers. But this is a process, this rebalancing process is just starting in Asia now. You're bridging it through stimulus and sort of loose monetary and fiscal policy settings. But what really needs to carry it through are deeper structural reforms, and they need to be accelerated relatively quickly if you want to, should we say, make up for the permanent loss in final demand you've seen in the US and Europe. So that's going to be the real kicker. To what extent can Asia rebalance growth, regenerate domestic sources of growth through deeper structural reforms?
Okay, so maybe it's time to stop now. Thank you all for your high valuable contribution. As promised, what's your view? Okay, are you optimistic? You see a mild recession in Europe, Asia being able to get through, yourself being able to get through, or do you see something more catastrophic? So, I mean, if we try to vote, I'll go for the mild scenario. I don't know about you, if you could raise your hand just to give a broad idea. Mild scenario? 1, 2. Oh, people aren't that optimistic then. So, catastrophic scenario? Okay, mild. 1. Okay, so let's assume mild scenario would be the retained option for the time being. Okay, thank you so